Freedom of movement is a human right enshrined in such documents as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the Soviet Union, however, which was never a signatory to the UDHR, there was a distinct lack of freedom of movement. While it was possible for a Soviet citizen to move about the country, there were definite restrictions on where people could go and the length of time they could stay there. And to control all of this, every citizen had an internal passport, the Passport Grazdanina. I'm your host David, and today we are going to be talking about the Soviet passport system and some of its impacts on Soviet life. This is the Cold War. The Cold War was all about alliances and diplomatic moves, just like the sponsor of today's video, Conflict of Nations. This free online PvP strategy game is set in the late 20th and the early 21st century, allowing you to lead a real country in modern global warfare. The new Cold War scenario that is set up in the 1980s features historically accurate borders and units from the era, creating a completely new geopolitical balance of power and allowing you to choose between playing as the US or the USSR. The world depends on your strategy. Engage in nuclear warfare, defeat your enemies, rewrite history. Every match has up to 128 human players, making every game unique. You can use tanks, jets, warships, and infantry to dominate the world, either declaring war or allying with other players using your own tactics. For us, the most fun aspect of Conflict of Nations is that you can use long-term strategy in real time, making matches both challenging and fun. The fact that you can play both on PC and mobile phone means that you can jump into battle anytime you want. Conflict of Nations has a unique offer for our viewers. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so don't waste time. We've also created a special game for our subscribers. Details will be available at the end of the video. See you on the battlefield! Okay, so to understand the Soviet passport system, we need to go back to the Soviet Union's predecessor state, the Russian Empire. Peasants in the empire were tied to the land as serfs, unable to leave. Since the reign of Peter I, that's the Great by the way, he had instituted a passport system to help control the movement of people as part of his reform and modernization programs, and to ensure that the government knew where to tax people. While Alexander II had freed the peasants in 1861, the passport system, which was enforced by local police, remained largely in place until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The internal passport was one of the platforms that the Bolsheviks used against the Tsarist government, pledging to abolish it, a promise they followed through with by 1923. The tumultuousness of the 1920s Soviet Union, however, resulted in large population movements throughout the new country, and it became apparent that some form of control was going to be necessary. In 1932, passport reform was introduced and began to be rolled out the following year. One of the driving factors behind the 1932 decision was making it easier to identify undesirable citizens: kulaks, former Tsarist officials, priests, members of the nobility, and the like. The new passport would be rolled out equally across the Soviet Union. Everybody would have one, and it would be tied to a person's residential registration where they lived. This was shown in the passport by the official stamp, the propiska. The passportization process began in the larger cities. Those living within 100 kilometers of Moscow and Leningrad received a passport, and those within 50 kilometers of Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa, Minsk, Rostov, and Vladivostok would also get one. Additionally, anyone living within 100 kilometers of the western frontier of the Soviet Union would be required to have one as well. It was publicly justified as a better way to regulate the population living in cities, workers' settlements, and other residential areas, as well as identify those who were not engaged in productive work so they could be removed. The side benefit, of course, was removing the kulaks, criminals, and other antisocial elements. Now, that was in urban areas. The situation in the rural areas was rather different. Only villagers living in the sovkhoz areas, state farms, were entitled to passports. Everybody else got nothing, which meant they couldn't move away from where they were. And even the villagers who were entitled to a passport had limits placed on them. The government deliberately created complicated procedures to actually get a passport. This was all done to prevent villagers and farmers from fleeing the countryside to the cities. Now, for villagers who qualified, a passport would be issued jointly by the kolkhoz leadership, the local government, and the local party apparatus. So, keeping in mind that passports were registered to where a person lived, those passports would be valid for 1 year, meaning that if the person was trying to relocate to a different area of the country, that person had 1 year to obtain a valid residence registration, or they would be breaking the law. Also, keep in mind that you couldn't get a new residency registration without a passport in the first place. All of this, combined with the fact that the kolkhoz often simply refused to issue a passport in the first place, made any kind of travel, let alone relocation, incredibly difficult. Any villagers who decided to try moving without a passport were subject to punishment, including imprisonment. All of this was done to keep them down on the farm. Effectively, the Soviet government had recreated the serfdom that Alexander II had abolished. But instead of working for the nobility, the peasants now worked under the banners of the state for an ideology that claimed to set them free. So, a bit about the passports themselves. They contained information about the holder, including the person's first and last name, as well as patronymic. Place and date of birth were recorded, as well as the holder's ethnic status and social status, meaning if they were a worker, a state servant, a student, a peasant, etc. A permanent address was recorded, as well as place of work and their conscription status. From October 1937, the passport also required to have a photo of the person. With this type of information in it, the passport was not only just used for travel, it was used when applying for work as well. It was a mandatory part of the application process. Now, also included in the passport could be secret notes placed by the authorities. From August 8, 1936, this included secret notes in the passport of former convicts. Since the passport had to be presented when applying for work, it made it hard for these former convicts, especially those who had been convicted for political crimes, to find work. The Passport Grazdanina became the document to prove a citizen's identity. In order to travel, the passport was required. And then there were the rules when traveling away from a person's approved residence. A traveler was required to register with local authorities within 24 hours of arriving in a new area. If somebody was away from their registered residence for more than 2 months, the propiska for that permanent residence needed to be removed. Except it was up to the local authorities in the new area if they were going to accept that person to live there and grant them a new propiska. This allowed the government a significant amount of control over migration and just generally where people lived. It also made it significantly easier for the authorities to locate, and if they wanted, harass and arrest anybody they needed to, or wanted to. The passportization process was completed by 1937, with millions of villagers deliberately prevented from receiving a passport. And how did Moscow justify this, in a country that was supposed to free the people from their chains? Well, they were pretty blunt about it, actually. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia clearly stated the aims of the passport system, stating that the Soviet passport system never concealed its class nature and used it in line with the class struggle and aims of the dictatorship at various stages of building socialism. Okay, and then the war happened. But this time, not much changed regarding the passport system. In 1949, that paragon of reform, Lavrenti Beria, suggested reformation of the system, including the provision of passports to the rural villages, but this suggestion was rejected. And then the mustache died, and things changed. Well, a little bit anyway. In late 1953, a new decree from the Soviet ministers approved what had been Beria's idea on the decrease of regime territories and passport-related restrictions. As part of this, the residents of almost 150 new towns and villages would receive passports. But that still left much of the countryside without the vital document, which would allow them to even try and leave the farms. In the post-Stalin era, there was a general feeling of hope that would see an end to the repressions and introduction of waves of liberalization. And in many areas of Soviet life, that was the case. But not for passports and freedom of movement. It was understood that the agricultural reforms spearheaded by Khrushchev would be difficult, if not impossible, to implement if increased freedom of movement were granted. Khrushchev was a reformer, but at the end of the day, the governing philosophy never changed. The needs of the individual can be sacrificed for the needs of the state. For the Corn Lords' agricultural plans to succeed, that's the Virgin Lands campaign you'll recall from our earlier video, Khrushchev knew that he could not let agricultural workers leave the farms, which would happen if they were given passports. Kolkhoz workers generally had poor living and working conditions and would likely take advantage of the opportunity to leave if given the chance. February 27, 1958 saw the Minister of Internal Affairs Nikolai Dudorov issue these secret instructions to the ministers of the republics. Do not allow citizens from rural, unpassported areas outside of his or her oblast or republic unless for seasonal works based on documents from the village Soviets and kolkhozes. The intent was very clear: keep the agricultural workforce intact. Khrushchev era did see one major reform to the passport system, however. The change was the result of the de-Stalinization process, as groups and individuals were given amnesties for their various crimes. Starting from 1956, various ethnic groups that had been exiled under Stalin, like the Kalmyks, the Balkars, the Karachaya, the Chechens, the Ingush, and many more who had been exiled to the Far East in perpetuity, were allowed to return and given passports to do so. Additionally, Soviet soldiers who had been prisoners of war and had been punished for political crimes as a result had new passports issued that did not contain the secret notes containing their now forgiven crimes. The green-covered Passport Grazdanina, with all of its restrictions on who it would be issued to, remained in place until 1974. At that time, it was decided to issue new internal passports, with every citizen eligible, including villagers, kolkhoz workers, and other rural dwellers. Fewer documents needed to be submitted to get the passport, and less information was recorded in it. The new passport system also came with a general loosening of internal travel restrictions, including not requiring citizens to register with the authorities unless the stay in an area was going to be for a longer period of time. These newer red-covered passports would remain in effect until even beyond the end of the Soviet Union, until each new country began to issue their own. Now, related to internal passports and the propiska, the stamp indicating where you're allowed to live, were the closed cities. These were cities or even regions which were closed to outsiders, those who were simply not allowed to live there without permission. They were officially called Closed Administrative Territorial Units, or ZATO, and many were established after the Second World War. The ZATO often contained industrial or scientific facilities whose aim was to develop, produce, and/or use various different products which were deemed to be secret. The original construction of these closed cities began with the Soviet atomic project, but quickly expanded to other cities with prominent military production facilities, electrical engineering projects, the space program, chemical and virology programs, and other such things. Effectively, it was a method for the Soviet government to be able to hide from outsiders any facilities and industries they wanted to. Now, not all closed territories were the same. There were different levels of being closed. For example, some cities contained secret production facilities of state importance. A notable example of this is the current city of Ozyorsk in Chelyabinsk Oblast. Originally named Chelyabinsk 40 and then Chelyabinsk 65, it was sited near the nuclear reactor at Mayak. Home to such a sensitive industry, the city was closed to anybody without special authorization. It actually remains a closed city to this day. Other cities with less sensitive projects, like Perm or Gorky, now named Nizhny Novgorod, were closed to foreigners due to the presence of large military-related production facilities. Militarily sensitive cities would often be closed to foreigners, including Vladivostok, which was home to the Pacific Fleet, as well as Severomorsk in Murmansk Oblast, where many of the Northern Fleet submarines were based. But it wasn't just towns or cities that could be closed. Regions could be closed to outsiders as well. Notable among these was Kaliningrad, due to its location on the border. The naming convention for the Zatos, by the way, was to take whatever the name of the nearest normal city was and add a post office box number to it, hence Chelyabinsk 65, Arzamas 16, or Sverdlovsk 44. Many of these cities were built after the Second World War using the slave labor provided by the Gulag. To help ensure they remained closed to those who the government deemed should not be there, they were surrounded by barbed wire and had guards patrolling the perimeter. Checkpoints were set up at designated entrances where the internal passports of those trying to enter would be checked to verify if entry was permitted. Access to the Zato was controlled by the internal passport with the appropriate propiska. Only people officially registered to the Zato and their families were allowed to live there. Visitors could only come if they had special authorization. Residents of these closed cities had to sign written pledges that they would not talk about their actual place of residence, and violation of the pledge could result in criminal prosecution. In order to maintain the secret but still have accurate census data, the populations of these cities were counted as being part of the population of the largest regional city. If they were asked where they lived, residents would simply say they were from the regional city itself, Chelyabinsk instead of Chelyabinsk 65. Okay, so living in a closed city obviously had its difficulties, but there was a positive side. On average, those living in a Zato earned a 20% premium on their salaries, and they had better access to goods and products that may have been in short supply elsewhere in the country. Crime levels were also lower in Zatos, and healthcare services tended to be better in quality. The Soviet Union used the passport as a tool to control the movement of its citizens. Even reform-minded leaders like Khrushchev refused to grant freedom of movement as they knew the degree of disruption it would create across the country and to the system that sustained the Soviet Union. But the enforcement of the internal passport system and its rules highlighted that the Soviet Union lacked a basic respect for fundamental civil rights. In a country and system that was supposed to be class-free, the Passport Grazdanina clearly demonstrated that there was a class hierarchy with some citizens able to access more rights than others. The sponsor of today's video, Conflict of Nations, is a free online PvP strategy game happening in modern global warfare. Remember to download it through the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days. If you want to join the match created by us, both the game ID and password are the Cold War. See you on the battlefield. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have obtained the correct stamp in your green book so that you may press the bell button. Violators will be sent to Norilsk in perpetuity. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at thecoldwartv. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is the Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.